So what I want to do in the next 15 minutes or so is to speak to a topic that a lot of my own HDR students raise in the classroom in the course of supervision, and that is the question of engaged or applied anthropology. And in particular, I'm going to try to think through activist research as a particular kind of method, and it's linked to questions of positionality of anthropologists and also the politics of anthropological knowledge production. In doing so, I have at the forefront of my thinking many ideas that have come up in the course of the workshop so far, from the invitation to practice humility that Michael invoked, to the ethos of sincerity that Daniel spoke to questions of fraught allegiances that Randy discussed in her paper, and to broader questions of positionality that all of you in some way or another raised through your own comments and questions. So I won't be able to address all of these, but I'm really hoping we can do some sort of cross-pollination of these different aspects to methodology in the Q&A. So in using the term activist research, I am borrowing from the anthropologist Charles Hale, who uses this concept to describe a practice that goes beyond just cultural critique, and that can in some ways help us better understand the root causes of inequality, oppression, violence, and related conditions of human suffering. Hale talks about activist research as a practice carried out at each phase, from the conception of a project through to the dissemination and incorporation with collectives of peoples who may be subject to the conditions that one is investigating. The premise here is that there is no necessary contradiction between active or engaged political commitment to resolving problems identified in the field and rigorous scholarly analytical research on that problem. And in fact, Hale argues that activist research, if carried out in a responsible and ethical way, has the potential to lead to better research outcomes, to deeper and more thorough empirical understandings of the problems at hand, as well as theoretical insights that might be otherwise difficult to achieve. Of course, activist research comes with its own share of tensions, of contradictions, and of ethical dilemmas, as well as particular risks and vulnerabilities, which of course is the overarching theme of this particular panel. What I'm going to try to argue is that these dilemmas are often best addressed in conversation with the people who make our fieldwork possible and upon whose lives and worlds we build both our careers and our capital. And more broadly, I think what I want to do, drawing from my own experiences of trying to put activist research into practice, is to consider how do we understand activism in the first instance? How is it a political stance and also a pragmatic tool? Can academic endeavors like ethnographic writing or theory making also count as activist when they challenge particular institutional status quo? What are the implications of activist research for the presence and futures of social science research, and whether or how it can be decolonized? Again, I'm raising these questions not because I have good answers for them, but because they are questions that my own students ask of me, of the field, and of themselves. So a brief overview of the talk. I'll start by explaining to you a little bit about my own shift from activist to activist researcher. I'll give you a few examples of what this looks like in practice, and then I'll hone into one particular case study focused on participatory mapping that I've conducted in West Papua, and the kinds of insights that bringing an applied edge to this particular cartographic production process offered. And I'll close with some very brief reflections, rethinking the what, the why, and how of activist research, and the possibilities and pitfalls that arise in thinking about engagement as a form of reciprocity, as a form of giving back, or perhaps better, of standing with. So I mentioned positionality in the opening. Let me tell you a little bit more about where I'm coming to this talk from in terms of my own professional trajectory. So I suppose the starting point for me was a kind of long-standing interest in questions of injustice, interests that were sparked by early childhood and adolescent experiences, traveling, studying, and working in Tibet, where I really came face to face with forms of colonial oppression and cultural dilution among the Tibetan nomadic communities in the region where I was conducting my research and teaching. I then worked briefly for UNESCO in the space of education and literacy before moving on to a sort of more not-for-profit space through the NGO Forest Peoples Programme, which is a collective of anthropologists and lawyers who work in partnership with Indigenous communities across the tropics to document human rights violations and seek redress and remedy for Indigenous peoples, violations of Indigenous peoples' rights to land, consent and self-determination. It was that activist work that brought me to visit Indonesia and specifically West Papua, where I ended up conducting my doctoral and postdoctoral fieldwork. I originally visited the region again as a sort of policy advisor for the NGO FPP, and it was at the request of the communities that I come to conduct longer-term fieldwork in the region that would supplement or inform the often sort of helicopter forms of interviews, questionnaire-based research that I was doing in an NGO context. So there was a shift in positionality here, right, from activist to activist researcher. And that, of course, came with some difficult but necessary negotiations in terms of what I could and could not do with and for the communities who are making this research possible. So some really strong connective tissues here with the question of expectations and obligations that Randy raised in her presentation. Fieldwork, anthropological methods, which many of the communities whom I was working with had familiarized themselves with, either from readings or from prior researchers in the areas, seemed to offer something more and different to what activism alone could. From deep immersion in the everyday lives of peoples, to the longue durée of hanging out with different communities and their environments, to an attention to the messiness and complexity of these lived realities, messinesses that are often necessarily simplified in the context of being heard or heeded by governments and industry in an advocacy context. People also spoke about their dissatisfaction with the very notion of human rights and a rights framework to understand their life worlds and their experiences. And they really wanted this fieldwork to attend to not just, vertical conflicts between communities, government and industry in the area, but also to horizontal dissent, frictions and disagreements within communities themselves around what the future looked like, who lays claim to it, and what self-determination and sovereignty look like or might look like in this particular region of the world, West Papua. That being said, activism was always a precondition to this anthropological research and that sort of applied edge. And it often took the form of a combination of scholarly outputs with a whole range of public-facing outputs and engagements, from talks, lobbying, translations of petitions, support in court cases, and so forth, which were really, again, a precondition for any sort of a research interaction or engagement. So, Pache Hale, whom I quoted earlier, one of the ways in which we tried to bring that sort of engaged edge to the project was to really design it from the very outset in the collaboration with the communities on the ground. Men, women, youth, elders, Papuans based both in rural and urban areas, formal customary representatives, state representatives, and so forth. So the locations, the interlocutors, the methods, the research questions were all ones that we tried to co-craft. And indeed, it resulted in a research project that was vastly different to what I had originally thought I might be studying, which was the question of food security. We put together the ethics application together, for instance, right? Which in itself was an absolutely fascinating process. You can approach sort of human research ethics applications as sort of tick the box, jump through the loopholes of what the university wants out of you, but you can also approach it as a really, really insightful exercise in thinking through the situatedness of what ethics means for the peoples with whom we work. A great example of how that came through in the process that we underwent together with the communities in Papua was the question of pseudonyms, right? Which, according to scholarly conventions, one uses to protect one's interlocutors, but that most of my friends were absolutely adamant one should not use, because to take away someone's name was yet another form of theft that replicated, amplified, perpetuated thefts over lands, sovereignties and bodies that have, long characterized the histories and presence of West Papua under multiple colonial rules. Co-designing the project from the outset together also meant that the bigger picture, using the language of my friends here, was really, really important, right? So this was going to be not just the village ethnography, it had to take into account broader forces, broader processes and dynamics that were impinging upon the life world of the peoples whom I had the privilege to be learning from and thinking with. That included global supply chains and geopolitical arrangements, histories of collusion between Australia, where I was based, and Indonesia, where I was doing the field work. And all of these aspects of the design then fed in, again, not just into the scholarly outputs, but also in the range of public-facing endeavors that we were involved in, from op-eds and interviews to media features, webinars, one of which I'm showing a slide of here with the Pulitzer Center and a group of fabulous Indonesian activists and journalists who work in Papua, the production of participatory maps that I'll speak to in a second, and more recently, the development of a embryonic graphic novel with two Papuan artist activists. So, awesome. Let me move on quickly to the case study that I want to speak to specifically here to sort of illustrate what activist research looked like in practice. So I'm going to speak to you about participatory mapping, which was an activity that I conducted when I was working for this NGO, the Forest Peoples Program, as part of a broader endeavor to support communities in documenting the importance of their lands and territories and using maps as evidence in court cases and in the negotiations to either reclaim lands that had been taken from them, particularly for extractive industries like mining and oil palm plantations, and as a way of basically making themselves visible and legible in the gaze of the state and the corporate sector. So I continued doing participatory mapping when I sort of shifted positionality to a researcher. Many of the GPS equipment, the drones, the trainings and workshops I co-organized with local Papuan NGO activists, and the mapping itself was conducted by the communities themselves in different groups: men, women, youth, elders, village-based cohorts, clan-based cohorts, and so forth. What emerged from doing this process of cartography as an anthropologist, with the positionality of a researcher, was something quite different to what I experienced or witnessed when I was a pure activist, if you wish. And so those differences took many forms. The first was that, first of all, the sort of mapping I'd done in the NGO context was very much focused on land boundaries, land claims, land rights, and questions of the land's value in economic or livelihoods or subsistence terms. And that was a strategic and pragmatic decision. Questions of livelihood and subsistence were ones that the government, corporations could understand, right? That were legible to those outside actors. Mapping, when I was there doing sort of my long-term field, it was very, very different. It was much more about sort of tracing relationships across place and beyond boundaries. It was about the cultural, spiritual, and cosmological values of the terrains and landscapes being mapped. And more importantly, or just as importantly, it was about mapping space in more than human terms. As we were hearing about life histories earlier from Catherine, mapping for many of the communities who I work with is about telling multi-species life histories. And one does that by following the sounds or the voices of species across the landscape, particularly birds, but also abiotic beings like the wind and the rain, like changing weather formations and phenomena, the sound of sago fronds, the sound of people singing, chanting, weeping at times. There was a deeply, richly multi-sensory dimension to mapping that hadn't been part of the kind of mapping I had done purely as an activist. And people said that was because, that's not what activism is interested in, and it's certainly not what governments and corporations are going to pay attention to or take seriously. So that was one key difference. Another key difference, of course, was the fact that it wasn't just about mapping as a sort of strategic endeavor to reclaim lands. Mapping was also an incredible opportunity for people to reflect together on their own position as mappers, as beholders and observers of the landscape, of their own relationship to these sites and species that were being mapped, and the sounds and stories through which these species were being known. It was also an opportunity for people to discuss and often, engage in heated arguments around the challenge of reconciling the strategic value of maps as advocacy tools, and their cultural value as resources produced by and for communities themselves, right? So questions around who owns a map and who gets to do the mapping. What are the limits and potentials of technologies like GPS and drones in representing landscapes that are constantly on the move? How does one make sure that these soundscapes or mapscapes are heard and heeded by outside actors? And how does one represent in a single map the experiences, relations, and perspectives of not just men, but also women, of youth and elders, of Papuans across rural and urban divides? All of those debates and conundrums, again, had not at all been part of my earlier experiences mapping as an activist. They really only surfaced in the course of later exercises and experiments in walking the landscape together, learning to listen to it, learning to, think through sounds as coordinates, and paying close attention to the debates that people have amongst themselves around advocacy, activism, and anthropology. So I want to close really quickly by invoking the words of a scholar who's been hugely influential in my own thinking around the ethics of engaged research. And this is Kim Tolbert, but there's STS scholar, who in her work pushes back against the language of engaged research as a form of giving back, right? A form of return on the investments of time and resources, the generosity, the risks that people take in welcoming us more or less willingly into their worlds. And instead, Kim invites us to think about research and engagement as a form of standing with, right? Standing with, she argues, invites the kind of politics of research that is not about objectivity or necessarily distancing or separating the field from the analysis or the researcher from research interlocutors. Rather, it's one that's centered on the co-constitution of knowledge and of practice, in concert with the acts and with the claims of those who we inquire among. It's also a practice, Kim writes, that is anchored in a recognition that we as scholars are always actually already caught up in the claims that others in the field act out. And this is different from speaking on behalf of these people, in the sense that speaking on behalf already presumes or assumes a divide or a separation between the researcher and the research subject. So when I talked about this practice of standing with my Papuan friends, they offered some really, insightful thoughts on this question of what it means to think through activism beyond a kind of researcher-researched binary. And the way they did that was to invite me to think with palm oil, right? The part of West Papua where I'm working is one that is subject to rampant oil palm plantation proliferation. This is one of the main contexts in which maps become useful to reclaim lands from incoming palm oil corporations. And for many Marines, the plant of oil palm itself, the product that is palm oil, was that connective tissue. It was that material semiotic entity or figure, in Haraway's term, that could help me, that could help them, that could help us think beyond the subject-object divide in research. Why? Well, oil palm oil might be grown in out-of-the-way resource frontiers like West Papua, where I'm conducting my research, but it's also ubiquitous in the everyday commodities, ingredients, foods, cosmetics that we purchase in our parts of the world, right? It connects us across space, across time, across different histories of colonization, extraction, occupation. And so, thinking with the materiality of that particular plant, that particular product, was one way in which my friends invited me to rethink standing with across sort of the different geographical and cultural scapes that we were operating in and within. Of course, for all the strengths of an activist research sort of methodology, ethical conundrums are inevitable. And then more than inevitable, they are really important prompts for reflection. So some of the questions that have come up for me and that I've tried to bring into the fold of conversations with my Papuan friends and companions includes when you are studying powerful people and institutions, for instance, governments, corporations, what do you do when you don't necessarily identify ethically or politically with their worldviews? How do you fit those stories into the fold of ethnographic writing? What if you uncover information or analyses that could be detrimental to or even perceived as unduly critical of the interests of the peoples with whom you have developed a privileged or particular relationship? What if your research on both sides of any particular conflict requires that they perceive you as strictly neutral, objective, or not aligned? And what if that goes contrary to your own ethical, political sensibilities? What if part of your research uncovers influences that shape the consciousness of your subjects in ways that might orient them to distrust or to dismiss the practical implications or political implications of your findings? And how does one avoid the hero or savior complex in doing this sort of engaged research, whilst also not withholding from harnessing or activating the resources, networks that are available to us as researchers and that might not be available to those whom we research with or alongside? I'm offering a lot of questions and far fewer answers, but maybe that's what social science is about, asking better questions of ourselves and of others, whilst also challenging that self and other distinction. My experience has been that most of the time these are questions that are best addressed, again, in conversation with the peoples whom one works with in the field, alongside with peers in one's disciplines and consonant fields, as well as, of course, with scholars from the places where one conducts one's research. In my case, with indigenous scholars of Papua and of the Pacific. I think it's really important to write about the kinds of ethical conundrums and vulnerabilities that arise in the course of trying to conduct activist research or engaged anthropology. And part of that, of course, entails thinking carefully and critically and caringly and capaciously about the situatedness of ethics, how there is perhaps no one-size-fits-all, and that a particular context, the circumstances of the field will shape what is and isn't ethical and for whom. I think equally important, of course, when one's considering questions of risk and vulnerability in engagement is risk and vulnerability for whom? Which kinds of risks are worth it? Which ones are not? Again, in whose perspective? How does one avoid the moral hazard of taking risks when one will not be the direct recipient of the risk reprisals that might ensue? And also when it comes to writing about activism and producing non-scholarly research outputs, where are you placing these materials? Who are the audiences that you want them to reach? How might one be strategic in terms of telling the story differently in different places for different ends, right? Now, one could describe that as perhaps a form of ethically dubious shape-shifting, ethically dubious or perhaps, less than sincere research, to invoke Daniel's terms. But my experience is that, again, thinking about these questions in strategic, alongside political and ethical terms can be incredibly valuable because it multiplies, it situates, it complexifies how we understand ethics in the very first instance and how ethics shape-shifts across different sites, different scales, and different subjects. So anthropology as a shape-shifting ethical practice will be my closing invitation, and I'll leave it at that.